The morning Nora Wells was told she had 1 hour to pack her life and walk away from everything she had ever loved. The sun was barely 2 fingers above the eastern ridge, and the dew still clung to the tall grass like it had not yet received the news that the day intended to be cruel. She was 26 years old, and she had been born in the same bedroom where her mother had died bringing her into the world, on the same land where her father had broken his back every single day for 30 years, building something real and lasting and worth keeping. The Wells homestead sat in the broad, flat valley just south of Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1882, and it was not a grand property by any measure that wealthy men used to judge such things. But it had a working well, a solid 2-room cabin with a stone chimney her father had laid himself, a small barn that smelled of cedar and old hay, and 42 acres of grazing land that stretched toward a line of cottonwoods along a creek that had never run dry even in the worst summer drought any old-timer could recall. Her father, James Wells, had filed the original claim on that land in 1861, before the war swallowed so many good years, and he had paid the fees in full and held the deed in a tin box under the floorboards beneath the kitchen table. He had died 2 winters ago from a chest sickness that took him slowly, the way a candle burns down rather than being snuffed, and he had left everything to Nora because she was all he had. She had buried him beneath the cottonwoods, where he liked to sit in the evenings, and she had kept the ranch going with her own 2 hands and the help of an elderly Mexican hand named Miguel who came around most mornings in exchange for meals. So when 3 men rode up to her gate on that Wednesday morning in late September of 1882, Nora was not frightened at first. She was standing at the fence line, watching the sky turn from pink to gold, holding a tin cup of coffee and thinking about the fence post that had heaved itself crooked over the summer and needed straightening before the first freeze. She heard the hoofbeats and turned, shading her eyes, expecting perhaps a neighboring farmer or a peddler from town. What she saw instead made her stomach go cold. The man riding in front was Harlan Briggs. She knew him by his hat, which was the color of old bone, and by the way he rode, upright and self-satisfied, like a man who has decided the world owes him a permanent debt. Harlan Briggs owned the grain exchange in Caldwell and the livery on 2nd Street and a dozen other pieces of the town's commerce. And for the past year, he had been making it very clear to every farmer and rancher in the valley that he intended to own a great deal more. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, with a jaw like a brick and small pale eyes that calculated everything they looked at in terms of what it was worth to him. The 2 men riding behind him were his men, the sort of hired muscle that wore their guns low and spoke rarely and looked at everything the way a dog looks at a piece of meat. Nora set down her coffee cup on the fence post and waited. She kept her chin level. She had learned long ago that showing fear to men like Harlan Briggs was an invitation. He reined up outside her gate and did not dismount, which told her everything about what kind of visit this was. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document and held it out without moving toward her, making her come to him if she wanted to see it. She walked to the gate and took it without a word. She unfolded it. Her eyes moved over the language twice, and then a 3rd time, because the words did not make sense the first 2 times in any world she understood to be real. The document was signed by Judge Emmett Carver, the circuit judge who came through Caldwell once a month and whose court was held in the back room of the hotel on Main Street. It declared that the title to the Wells homestead, 42 acres including all structures thereon, had been determined to be improperly filed under the Homestead Act of 1862, specifically citing an irregularity in the survey coordinates originally recorded with the Sumner County Land Office. It further declared that the land had been reassigned by lawful order to a holding company called Western Territorial Developments, and that any person currently occupying the property had 60 days from the date of filing, which date, Nora quickly realized as she read further, had already passed 2 months prior, meaning the notice had been filed without her ever receiving it. Harlan Briggs smiled at her the way a man smiles when he knows he has one and wants you to know it too. The notice was posted in accordance with the law, he said, at the county office and in the Caldwell Journal. Can't help it if you don't read the paper, Miss Wells. Her hands were shaking. She pressed the paper flat between her palms to still them. This is my father's land. His deed is recorded. He paid the filing fees. I have the original papers in this house. That deed has been found defective, Briggs said flatly. The survey was wrong. The land was never properly yours under the law. Whose survey? She asked. Whose findings? The county's, all properly done. He leaned forward slightly in the saddle. I'm being generous, Miss Wells, coming out here personally. The legal period is already expired. By rights, I could have the sheriff here with a removal order. Instead, I'm giving you an hour to collect your personal belongings. Anything that's in this house by 8 o'clock this morning becomes property of Western Territorial Developments. That is your company, Nora said. It was not a question. Briggs did not deny it. He simply straightened in the saddle. 1 hour, he said. I'll wait. He pulled his horse to the side of the gate and settled in like a man who has nothing but time, which was the most infuriating thing about him, that he truly did not feel any urgency about what he was doing to her, that dismantling her life was simply a line item in his day. Nora turned and walked back to the house. She walked slowly because she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her run. Inside, she pressed her back against the closed door and breathed. Her heart was hammering. Her mind was racing. She knelt and pulled up the floorboard and took out the tin box and opened it, and there was her father's deed, handwritten and signed and witnessed, and there was the receipt from the land office with the seal on it, and all of it was real, and all of it was right, and all of it meant nothing if a judge had already signed a paper saying otherwise. She did not pack her things. She sat at the kitchen table with the deed in her hands, and she thought, hard and fast, the way her father had taught her to think when something went wrong. He used to say that panic was a luxury that farmers could not afford, that when the creek flooded, or the crop failed, or the horse broke a leg, you had exactly 5 minutes to feel whatever you were going to feel about it, and then you had to start working the problem. She had maybe 50 minutes left of her hour, and she had a problem that needed working. Paul Calloway had been on the road from Wichita for 3 days when he stopped at the water trough outside Duffy's hardware store on the main road into Caldwell and let his horse drink. He was 30 years old, lean and weathered in the way that a man gets when he has spent most of his adult life out of doors, with dark hair that was a little too long because he had not been anywhere with a barber in several weeks, and brown eyes that were quiet and observant the way eyes get when they have seen enough that they have learned to look carefully before reacting. He was not exactly a drifter, though people who saw him on the road would have called him one. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer, and he had come west 10 years ago with the ambition of starting his own cattle operation, and he had gotten close twice, close enough to taste it. But cattle fever had taken his first herd in 1876, and a business partner with dishonest hands had taken most of his savings in 1879. And since then he had been doing what needed to be done, taking work where he found it, moving when there was no more work to find. He was a good hand with horses and a reasonable carpenter, and he had spent a year working as a surveyor's assistant, which had taught him more about land law and property filing than most men who had not studied it ever came to know. He was not riding to Caldwell for any particular reason. He had heard there might be work at one of the ranches east of town, and he was following the lead the way a man does when he has no better direction. He was watering his horse and watching the road and doing the kind of lazy, unfocused looking that a man does when his mind is quiet, when he heard it. It was a conversation happening on the boardwalk across the street, between 2 men in work clothes who were standing outside the feed store and talking in the easy, gossiping way of men who have known each other a long time and have already covered everything important and are now covering everything else. Most of it was the ordinary texture of small-town talk, the price of feed, someone's bull that had gotten through a fence, the weather turning. But then one of the men said something that made Paul stop moving and simply listen. "Heard Briggs rode out to the Wells place this morning," the first man said, "taking possession." "That widow woman," the second man said. "She ain't a widow, she never married, James Wells's girl. Been running that place on her own since James passed. Briggs getting her land too." The second man made a sound of disgust. "How many is that now?" "Third this year. He's been filing these defect claims through Carver's court. Survey irregularity, he calls it. Gets Carver to sign the reassignment. Then Briggs's company picks it up for pennies. Somebody ought to look into how Carver keeps finding these irregularities," the second man said. "Somebody ought to," the first man agreed in the tone of a man who means nobody will. "Heard he gave her 1 hour to clear out." Paul had stopped listening by then. Not because it ceased to interest him, but because his mind had shifted, quickly, and with the kind of clear decisiveness that he had come to trust in himself over the years, into a different mode entirely. He already knew what he was going to do. He had known it from the first sentence that had made sense to him, which was the sentence about a woman being given an hour to leave land that had been in her family for 2 decades. He had seen this kind of thing before. He had seen the mechanisms of it, the fraudulent survey claims, the compliant judges, the way powerful men used the law as a tool for theft while keeping their hands technically clean. He had worked for a land surveyor in 1879, a straight honest man named Atchison, who had shown him the proper way claims were filed, and the irregular ways they were contested, and he had a thorough enough understanding of the process to know that if a woman had her original deed and her father's filing receipts, she had a case that no reassignment order could simply paper over, not if she got it in front of someone who was not already in Harlan Briggs's pocket. He also knew that Caldwell's circuit court and its judge were only one venue. There was a federal land office, and there were federal courts, and while the machinery of those institutions moved slowly, the filing of a formal contest could halt any transfer of title while the matter was under review. You could not lawfully remove a person from contested land while the contest was active. That was federal law, and Emmett Carver was a county judge whose authority did not extend to overriding it. Paul paid for his horse's water and turned the animal around toward the center of town, looking for the county courthouse. Caldwell's courthouse was a modest 2-story building on the corner of Main and 3rd, built from the pale yellowish brick that was common in that part of Kansas, with a flag on a pole out front that was snapping hard in the September wind. Paul tied his horse at the post outside and went in. He was dusty from the road and his jacket needed brushing, and he had 2 days of stubble on his face, but he walked through the door the same way he walked everywhere, without hesitation, as if he had already decided he belonged wherever he was going. The county clerk's office was on the ground floor. The clerk was a nervous-looking man in his 40s named Gerald Potts, according to the small placard on his desk, and he looked up at Paul over the rims of his spectacles with the expression of a man who is professionally suspicious of strangers who walk in without appointments. Paul put both hands on the counter and looked at him directly. "I need to see the record of a land reassignment filed in the past 60 to 90 days, he said. "Property belonging to a James Wells, now Nora Wells, 42 acres south of town in the valley. I need to see the survey complaint that was filed with it, the name of the surveyor and the date of any notice posted." Potts blinked. "Those are public records," he said, with a tone that suggested he found it unfortunate that they were. "I know they are," Paul said. "That's why I'm asking." Potts went to his filing cabinet with the slowness of a man who hopes you'll give up and leave before he gets there. He did not hurry. Paul waited. After several minutes, the clerk laid a folder on the counter with a small, somewhat disappointed air, as if he had hoped to find that it was missing. Paul read through the documents quickly. He had a good eye for what he was looking for, and he found it in less than 2 minutes. The survey that had been filed to challenge the Wells claim had been conducted by a man named Davis Rourke, who was, according to the letterhead, a licensed surveyor operating out of Wichita. The survey itself listed boundary coordinates that differed from the original Wells filing by approximately 400 yards on the southern edge, placing the southern portion of the property outside the coordinates of the original homestead claim. But Paul had spent a year with a surveyor, and when he looked at the measurements cited in Rourke's survey and compared them against the original filing coordinates that were also in the folder, he saw something that Gerald Potts had almost certainly not bothered to look for, and that Emmett Carver had apparently not noticed or had not cared to notice. The bearing references used in Rourke's survey were calibrated to a magnetic north baseline that had not been in common use since before the establishment of the Kansas Geological Survey's corrected standards in 1876. In other words, the survey used an outdated reference point. Under the corrected standards, which were the ones legally required for all filings after 1876, Rourke's measurements did not demonstrate a defect. They demonstrated that Rourke had either made a deliberate error or had simply used old methodology to manufacture the appearance of a discrepancy. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, exactly the kind of specific technical objection that could form the basis of a formal contest filing with the Federal Land Office. Paul straightened up and looked at Potts. "I need a contestation form," he said. "Federal Form 63, the contest of adverse claim under the Homestead Act." Potts looked at him as if he had said something mildly offensive. "Are you a licensed agent? You have to be the claimant or a licensed attorney to file a formal contest on behalf of another party." "I'm not filing on her behalf," Paul said. "I'm going to ride out there and bring her in to file it herself. But I need the form, and I need to know that this office will time-stamp it with this morning's date when she brings it in." "There are procedures," Potts said. "I'm aware of the procedures," Paul said, and there was something in his voice that was perfectly civil and perfectly firm at the same time, the voice of a man who will not be moved by inconvenience or bureaucratic delay. "The procedures allow for a contest to be filed at any point before a transfer deed is officially recorded in the Federal Register. Has that transfer been recorded at the federal level?" Potts consulted his files with much the same enthusiasm as before. "No," he said at last. "The county order has been issued, but the federal transfer hasn't been filed yet." "Then there is time," Paul said. "Give me the form." He rode hard out of Caldwell, following the road south the way the men outside the feed store had indicated when he had stopped to ask. And the horse, a reliable gray named Smoke who had been with him for 3 years and knew when speed was required, stretched out into a full gallop without being asked twice. The Wells homestead came into view around the bend past the Second Creek crossing, the cottonwoods visible first, and then the cabin and the small barn. And as Paul came around the last curve in the road, he could see 3 horses tied at the gate, and Harlan Briggs sitting his horse with his thick arms folded, and his pale eyes tracking Paul's approach with the calculating attention of a man who is surprised to see something he did not account for. Paul pulled Smoke to a stop at the gate and looked at Briggs for a moment before he said anything, taking the measure of the man the way you take the measure of any potential obstacle, quickly and without emotion. "This property," Paul said. One of Briggs's men touched the rifle across his saddle. Paul did not look at it. "Who are you?" Briggs said. "Someone who just came from the courthouse," Paul said. "Miss Wells has the right to file a federal contest of the adverse claim before any transfer is recorded at the federal level. The county order doesn't end her rights. It initiates a process. Has she been advised of that?" Briggs's eyes narrowed. "That order is signed by the circuit judge." "County judge," Paul said. "Federal land originally filed under the Homestead Act falls under federal jurisdiction for contest purposes. County courts can issue findings, but they can't foreclose the federal process." He pulled the form from inside his coat. "I'm going to ask Miss Wells if she'd like to come with me to file this." Briggs was quiet for a moment. Paul could see him thinking, the small pale eyes moving over Paul's face, and then the document in his hand, and then back to his face, doing the arithmetic of whether this was a complication he needed to address now or could have addressed later. The fact that he did not simply send his men forward told Paul that Briggs was not entirely certain of his own ground, which meant there was room to move. "She's got 40 minutes left on her hour," Briggs said finally. "Then I'd best not waste any of them," Paul said, and pushed the gate open and rode up to the cabin. He dismounted at the door and knocked. There was a pause that lasted just long enough to tell him she had been watching from inside and was deciding whether or not to open the door to a stranger, which was the prudent thing to do. Then the door opened. Later, Paul would not be able to explain precisely what happened in those first few seconds, because the thing that happened was not the kind of thing that lent itself easily to explanation. He had knocked on hundreds of doors. He had stood at the thresholds of strangers' homes many times, introducing himself for one practical reason or another. It had never before been a thing that mattered beyond its immediate purpose. But when Nora Wells opened that door, with her brown hair pulled back from her face and her jaw set with the kind of determined composure that people hold together through sheer force of will, when what they actually want to do is fall apart, and her eyes, which were the dark gray-green of creek water in late October, looking at him with a wariness that was entirely earned and absolutely clear. Something shifted in him that he had not expected and that he did not quite know what to do with in that particular moment. He set it aside. There was no time for it. "My name is Paul Calloway," he said. "I just rode in from Caldwell. I heard about what's happening here and I've been to the courthouse, and I think you have a legal avenue that hasn't been closed yet, but we have to move now. Do you have your father's original deed and the filing receipts from the land office?" She looked at him for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, the kind of look that judges a person not on the surface details, but on whatever deeper quality comes through when someone is speaking truthfully. Then she said, "Yes, I have them here." "Then get them," he said, "and come with me." She did not ask him who he was or why he was helping her. She turned back into the cabin and was back at the door in under a minute with the tin box under her arm and a shawl around her shoulders and her chin at exactly the same level it had been when he first saw her, which told him a great deal about who she was. They rode to Caldwell. Briggs shouted something after them as they went through the gate and past his men, something about how it wouldn't matter, that this was already settled. But Paul did not turn around, and neither did Nora, who rode her own horse alongside him with a focus that was almost physical in its intensity. "What is a federal contest?" she said, after they had cleared the gate and were on the road. "Under the Homestead Act, a claim that's been challenged can be formally contested with the federal land office," he said, keeping his horse at a good clip beside hers. "If you file a contest, the transfer is frozen while the matter is under review. They can't legally record the transfer while the contest is active, and they can't remove you from the property while the transfer isn't recorded. How long does a review take? Weeks at minimum, months sometimes, but that's time. Time to get a proper attorney, time to build a real case." She was quiet for a moment. "What's the basis of the contest?" He told her about the survey, about the outdated reference standard, about Davis-Work's methodology. He explained it clearly and without condescension, the way a man explains something to a person he considers intelligent. She listened without interrupting, and when he was done she was quiet again briefly, and then she said, "My father hired a surveyor himself when he first filed the claim. There's a copy of that survey in the box." Paul glanced at her. "With the boundary coordinates?" "With everything," she said. "He was thorough. He was always thorough." "That's very good," Paul said, and meant it. "That's exactly what we need." They arrived at the courthouse at 8:30 in the morning. Gerald Potts looked at them with the expression of a man who had been hoping the situation would resolve itself into something simpler. It did not. Paul laid the form on the counter, and Nora Wells signed it with her father's deed and his survey and his filing receipts all spread out on the counter beside it, and Potts time-stamped it with the current date and gave them a receipt, and when he did, Nora let out a long, slow breath that she appeared to have been holding for some time. "Is it done?" she said. "For now," Paul said. "The contest is filed. The transfer is frozen. But Briggs will push back and Carver may try to find a way around it. You need an attorney." She looked at him with those gray-green eyes, and for the first time since he had knocked on her door, the composure she had been carrying like armor shifted just slightly, not into distress but into something more honest, something that was partly relief and partly exhaustion, and partly something else he couldn't quite name. "I don't have money for an attorney," she said quietly, so that Potts would not hear. "Let's talk about that," Paul said. They went outside and stood on the courthouse steps in the September morning light. The wind had picked up and it smelled of the coming autumn, dry grass and turning leaves and the particular cleanness of the plains air. Nora held the tin box against her chest with both arms and looked out at the street with the look of someone thinking very hard. Paul leaned against the post at the bottom of the steps and looked at her. He was very aware, standing that close, of the details that his practical mind had catalogued, and his less practical self had already decided mattered, the steadiness of her hands even now, the way she had been the one to mention her father's survey rather than waiting for him to ask, the quality of her attention when he had explained things to her. The absence of self-pity in her manner, even though she was standing on courthouse steps, having just been told that her family's land was being stolen from her through a fraudulent legal process. She was remarkable. He had met a lot of people in 10 years of moving through the West, and he could tell a remarkable person from an ordinary one the way you can tell good water from bad by the feel of it. "There's a lawyer in Wichita," he said. "Name of Harmon. He does land cases. He's honest and he knows the federal homestead statutes thoroughly. His fee is not small, but he sometimes works on an arrangement if the case has merit. And this case has merit." Nora looked at him. "You know a lot about land law for a man who just rode into town." "I worked for a surveyor for a year," he said. "And I grew up on a farm that my father almost lost to exactly this kind of thing, except cheaper and less sophisticated. They just ran the property line through his fields and told him he was off the claim. He didn't know enough to fight it and he lost." He paused. "I spent a long time after that learning enough to fight it." Something passed through her expression briefly, something that was recognition of a shared kind of wound. Then she said, "How far is Wichita?" "A day's ride, maybe a day and a half." "I can't leave the property unattended for 3 days," she said. "If Briggs sees me gone, he'll move to occupy it. He has men and I have." She stopped. "I have a 60-year-old farm hand who comes in the mornings." "Miguel?" Paul asked. She looked surprised. "You know him?" "No." One of the men outside the feed store mentioned him. He thought for a moment. "There's another option. Write the letter to Harmon yourself. I'll carry it to Wichita and bring him back, or bring his signed agreement to represent you. That way you can stay on the property." She was studying him with open curiosity now, the wariness still present but sharing space with something that was genuinely trying to understand what he was. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "You don't know me." He considered the question honestly. "I heard about what was happening to you and I knew how to help," he said. "That seems like enough reason." It was true as far as it went. It was also not entirely the whole truth, because the whole truth included things that had developed in the last 2 hours that he had not yet fully examined and was not sure how to present to a woman he had known for 2 hours. He kept those parts to himself. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Come to the property. I'll write the letter, and I'll make you breakfast because you look like you rode a long way this morning." He had, in fact, ridden a long way. He realized he was hungry the moment she said it. They rode back south together, passing through the gate of the Wells homestead without Harlan Briggs to greet them, because Briggs and his men had apparently decided that the morning's events required a strategic reassessment. This did not mean he was gone for good, and both of them knew it. But the gate was clear, and the property was quiet in the way of a place that has been tense and is now, temporarily, able to breathe. Miguel was there, a A small, wiry man with white hair under a battered hat and dark eyes that were sharp and watchful. He was mending a section of fence near the barn when they rode up, and he looked at Paul with the careful attention of a man who has no prejudice, but also no naivety. Nora introduced them briefly in the way of someone who is moving with purpose. Paul unsaddled his horse and put him in the small corral with Nora's horse and found the water and the hay and took care of the animal first, the way a man does when the horse has done good work. Then he went to the cabin. The interior was simple and clean, and organized with the particular neatness of a person who lives alone and has made their peace with the small size of their world by arranging it with care. There was a cast iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, shelves with provisions and a modest collection of books, a narrow bed visible through the doorway of the inner room, and on the wall near the window, a small mirror, and below it, a framed photograph of a man who must have been James Wells, thinner and older than Nora, but with the same jaw and the same cast of eyes, looking at the camera with an expression of quiet dignity. Nora moved around the kitchen with quick, efficient hands, putting the coffee on and cutting bread and frying the last of some bacon she had. Paul sat at the table and watched without comment, aware that there was something in the simple domesticity of the scene that was doing something to his composure, making him feel things about kitchens and mornings, and the company of another person that he had not let himself feel in a long time. She set the food down and sat across from him and they ate, and the conversation that came while they ate was different from the urgent practical talk on the road. It was slower and more exploratory, the kind of conversation that builds itself around real things. She asked him where he was from. He told her about Missouri and about his father's farm and about coming west. She told him about growing up here, about her father's hands and how they were always rough and how she had inherited the same roughness. She held up one hand briefly, a rancher's hand, and he noticed it and held up his own just as rough, and she smiled at that. And the smile was the first unguarded thing he had seen from her, and it was devastating in the best possible way. He told her about the surveyor Atchison and about what he had learned. She showed him her father's survey, which she had taken from the tin box, and he examined it carefully and confirmed what he had hoped, that the coordinates used were the updated standard ones, filed after 1876, which meant they were directly comparable to and contradicted by Rourke's fraudulent measurements. "This is your case," he said, tapping the document. This survey, filed properly by a properly credentialed surveyor, using the correct reference standard, on the date indicated here, which is 1879, 3 years after the standard was updated. And Rourke's survey uses the old standard. The discrepancy in their measurements isn't because the land was wrongly filed. It's because Rourke is using a different baseline. Any competent federal examiner will see that immediately. Nora was leaning across the table to look at the documents. She was very close enough that he could see the small scar near her left eyebrow and the way her hair fell forward when she bent her head, and he had to concentrate with some deliberateness on the survey. "My father would be so angry," she said softly. "He kept every record he ever made because he knew. He always said, someday someone's going to try to take what's ours and the papers are all that will stop them." "He was right," Paul said. She looked up and found him looking at her, and neither of them looked away immediately. And in the brief silence that followed, something settled between them like a note struck cleanly on a string, a resonance that had nowhere else to go. Then she got up to get more coffee, and the moment dissolved but did not disappear. It went into the room the way warmth from a fire goes into a room, invisibly present. She wrote the letter to Harmon after breakfast, at the table, while Paul wrote his own supplementary note, explaining the technical basis of the survey discrepancy, in terms that a land attorney would immediately recognize and value. She watched him write without looking over his shoulder, and when he handed her his note to read before sealing it with hers, she read it carefully and then looked at him with an expression that was both appreciative and slightly searching. "You could be an attorney," she said. "I've been told," he said. I never had the money for law school. The law doesn't always need school, she said. Sometimes it just needs someone who understands it and isn't afraid to use it. He rode to Wichita that afternoon. Nora stood at the gate of her property and watched him go, and he turned once at the bend in the road, and she was still there, and he raised a hand, and she raised a hand in return. He did not know why that small exchange mattered as much as it did. It just did. Wichita in 1882 was a town in the process of figuring out what it wanted to be when it grew up. The cattle drives that had made it wild and loud and profitable through the 1870s were shifting south and west, and the town was settling into something more domestic and commercial, with churches and schools and civic ambitions sitting alongside the last of the saloons and the gun check ordinances that Wyatt Earp had left behind when he moved on. It was still a real Western town, still carrying the residue of the years when it had been the end of the Kisham Trail, but it was also becoming a place where legal professionals and merchants and respectable citizens were staking their own kind of claim. Thomas Harmon's law office was on Douglas Avenue, above the bank, in a set of rooms that were appropriately serious and cluttered with the organized disorder of a man who reads a great deal and thinks even more. Harmon himself was in his mid-50s, a small spare man with a tidy gray beard and eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles that were extremely alert and gave the impression of filing everything they observed for later use. He read both letters while Paul sat across from him, and he read them the second time slowly, and when he was done, he set them down on the desk and looked at Paul over the tops of his spectacles. "The survey methodology argument is sound," he said. "Where did you learn this?" "I worked for an Atchison survey company in 1879 and 1880, Paul said. He was meticulous about the 1876 standard update and why it mattered. Harmon looked at him for a moment. "This Rourke, I know his name. He's done work like this before, calibrated to produce false discrepancies. He does it for pay, and he's been careful enough so far that no one has pinned it down clearly enough to act on." He tapped the letters. "This might be the case that pins it. Will you take it?" "I will take it," Harmon said. "Tell Miss Wells I'll accept a retainer of $40, which I believe is findable, and a percentage of the assessed land value if she prevails, which I believe she will." "She's on limited means," Paul said. "I know. The $40 covers my filing costs. The rest is contingent. That's the best I can do." He paused. "Can she find $40? Paul thought about it. "I think so," he said. "If not, I'll bring the $40 myself." Harmon looked at him with that filing expression. "Are you personally interested in this case, Mr. Calloway, or are you personally interested in Miss Wells?" Paul was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Both, I think." Harmon smiled, the brief private smile of a man who finds things to be as they should be. "Tell her to send the $40 by post or bring it herself when she can. I'll start the federal filing tomorrow." Paul rode back to Caldwell the next morning, arriving by midday. He had spent the night at a boarding house in Wichita, and spent part of the night lying awake looking at the ceiling thinking about Nora Wells in a way that he recognized as significant. Not the easy surface interest that came and went, but something deeper and less comfortable. The kind of feeling that sits in your chest and doesn't move. He found her property exactly as he had left it, the horses in the corral, Miguel working near the barn. He found Nora inside the cabin, and the relief on her face when she saw him come through the door was not a small thing. She had been alone on contested land for a day and a half with Harlan Briggs's shadow hanging over the property, and whatever she had been feeling about that, she had managed with the same composure she seemed to carry everywhere, but the relief was real. She looked at him and said, "Well." "Harmon will take it," he said. "He wants $40. She sat down at the table and he could see her calculating. "I have $32 and some cents," she said. "Father's watch is probably worth something." "Keep the watch," Paul said. He set $8 on the table between them. It was not a large portion of what he had, but it was what was needed. "Send the letter today and put 40 in it." She looked at the money and then at him, and there was something in her expression that he could not entirely read, something that was between gratitude and something that wanted to refuse the gratitude and something deeper than either of those. "I'll pay you back," she said. "I know you will," he said, which settled it. The next several weeks were the strange, suspended time that legal processes create, where the matter is in other people's hands, and the people most affected have to find ways to live inside the waiting. Harmon filed the federal contest on the 1st of October, and 3 days later Paul rode to the courthouse with Nora and watched Gerald Potts's uncomfortable face as they presented him with the federal filing number, which officially suspended any further county-level action until the federal review was completed. The transfer deed could not be recorded. The removal order could not be enforced. Harlan Briggs's mechanism had encountered a wrench. Briggs did not take this quietly. He sent word through an intermediary that he was prepared to offer Nora $300 for the property, and that this was a generous offer, and she would be wise to take it rather than spend money on a legal fight she would eventually lose. Nora read the message and set it on the stove and watched it burn, which Paul thought was about the most eloquent response she could have made. Paul had not left. He had stayed. It was not something that was explicitly discussed or decided. It simply happened in the way that things happen when they are natural. The first day after he returned from Wichita, he had helped Miguel repair the fence post that Nora had been thinking about before all of this began, and then he had repaired a second one. And by the third day, he was working around the property in the mornings and sitting at the table with Nora in the evenings, and neither of them had said anything specific about what this arrangement meant, because neither of them wanted to disturb it by naming it too soon. He slept in the barn in the clean hay, which was not uncomfortable, and smoke was good company. Nora was not a woman who gave herself away easily or quickly. He understood that. She had been running this place alone for 2 years with no one to rely on and had built the kind of self-sufficiency that is also, when you're honest about it, a kind of armor. She was warm. He could see the warmth in everything she did, in the way she spoke to Miguel, in the way she touched her father's photograph when she passed it, in the way she listened to Paul when he talked, with her whole attention, the way most people don't listen. But she was careful with herself. She kept her distance at a particular calibrated closeness that let things be comfortable between them without crossing into territory that either of them had named or probably yet fully understood. Paul worked on that distance the way you work on a shy horse, with patience and consistency and no sudden moves. He was there in the mornings. He fixed things that needed fixing. He talked to her about land law and about Missouri and about the books he had read, and she talked to him about her father and about cattle and about the books she had read, and there were several evenings where they sat on the step of the cabin after supper watching the September stars wheel overhead and talked until the fire inside had died to coals. One evening, about 2 weeks after he had first ridden up to her gate, they were sitting on the step in the late dusk and she said, "Do you miss Missouri?" He thought about it genuinely. "I miss the idea of it," he said. "The thing I thought it was before I knew it, the actual place I don't miss." He paused. "Do you ever want to go somewhere else?" She shook her head without hesitation and without apology. "This is where I'm from," she said. "This ground is where my father is buried. It's where I belong." "I used to want to be somewhere specific like that," he said. "I kept moving because I kept thinking the place was somewhere else." She looked at him sideways. "Do you still think that?" He held her gaze for a moment. The stars were out and the night air was cool and the grasshoppers were loud in the dark grass. "Less than I used to," he said. She looked away then, but slowly, and there was color in her face that the darkness did not entirely hide. Harlan Briggs was not a man who accepted obstacles without looking for ways around them, and in late October he found one, or thought he did. He retained his own attorney, a more aggressive practitioner than Carver, to file a response to the federal contest, arguing that the Wells family's original survey had itself contained errors, and that the discrepancy between the two surveys did not prove fraud but simply reflected the kind of imprecision that was common in early filings. It was not a bad argument on its face, and it complicated things enough that the federal examiner handling the review wrote to Harlan requesting additional documentation. Harlan wrote to Nora, and Paul rode to Caldwell to collect the letter and brought it back. The request was for the original surveyor's credential records, the name and licensure of the man who had done the Wells survey in 1879. Nora looked at the letter and then at Paul and said, "I don't know his name. My father never told me. He just said he hired a proper man through the land office." "The land office will have a record," Paul said. "Survey credentials had to be registered with the Kansas Geological Survey for all claims after 1876. It's a public record. Can you find it?" "I can try," he said. This sent him back to the courthouse, and then to Topeka, the state capital, because the Kansas Geological Survey offices were there, and the records he needed were not duplicated at the county level. It was a 3-day trip by horse, or significantly less by rail, and Caldwell had a connection to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line that ran north. He took the train to Topeka, which was a thing he had not done in several years, and which he found, as always, both impressive and slightly unsettling in the way of things that move very fast. Topeka was a proper city, with paved streets and office buildings and the full machinery of state government, and he navigated it with the careful attention of a man who is accustomed to the open country and finds cities both useful and slightly excessive. The Kansas Geological Survey records room was a magnificent and apparently inexhaustible archive of everything that had been measured, mapped, and filed in the state since the survey's establishment, and the clerk there was an earnest young woman who found the record Paul needed in under an hour. The surveyor who had done the Wells claim in 1879 was a man named George Ellsworth, credentialed in 1874 and recredentialed under the updated standards in 1877, with a clean record and no complaints. His survey of the Wells property was in the archive, stamped and dated and demonstrably using the correct 1876 standard baseline. Paul copied the relevant credential numbers and the archive reference carefully, and sent the information to Harlan by telegraph that afternoon, because the situation warranted the expense, and Harlan confirmed by return telegram that same day that the information was exactly what was needed, and that he would file the supplementary documentation with the federal examiner by the end of the week. On the train back to Caldwell, watching the flat Kansas landscape move past the window in the long horizontal way of it, Paul did something that he had been quietly doing for several weeks without formally admitting it to himself. He thought about what came after. He was a man without a fixed address and without a property, and without a plan that extended past the next season. He had been that man for several years and had made a kind of workable peace with it, the freedom of it and also the loneliness of it, which were different aspects of the same thing. He had told himself on various occasions that he preferred it this way, that the responsibility of a permanent place was something he wasn't ready for, that the wounds of the lost cattle and the dishonest partner had made him cautious in ways that were still unresolved. He now suspected that what he had actually been doing was waiting, without knowing what he was waiting for. He arrived back at the Wells homestead on a Thursday afternoon in early November, and Nora came to the door when she heard him ride up and stood in the doorway with the light behind her and her hands clasped in front of her and said, "Well." He told her what he had found, and her expression went through something complicated and compressed, relief and hope, and the careful management of hope that a person develops when they have been disappointed by hope before. He dismounted and handed Smoke's reins to Miguel and went to the step where she was standing, and he told her everything clearly, and when he was done she let out a long breath and sat down on the step and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment. He sat beside her, closer than he had been before, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. "Is it going to be all right?" she said. Her voice was steady, but it was working to be steady. "I think so," he said. "I honestly think so." She lowered her hands from her face and looked at him, and she was close enough that he could count the colors in her gray-green eyes, and what he saw in them was something she had been holding back for a while, something that was both asking and afraid of the answer. He reached over and took her hand where it was resting on the step between them. He did it simply, without performance, his rough hand over hers, and she looked down at their hands and then back up at him, and she did not pull away. "Whatever happens with the land," he said, "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "You've been in my barn for 5 weeks." "I have," he said. "That's a long time to stay somewhere for a woman you don't know." "I know you," he said. "I've been learning you for 5 weeks." The color was high in her face. The wind was moving in the cottonwoods by the creek, and the late afternoon light was falling long and golden across the grass, and all of it was so beautiful it almost hurt, the way that particular autumn light on the Kansas plains can be, unbearably clear and brief and real. "Paul," she said, and his name in her voice was the first time she had said it directly, and he felt it the way you feel the first warm day after winter, with your whole body. He squeezed her hand once, and then she turned hers over in his and held on. They sat there until the light went, talking and not talking, and when she went inside to make supper, she did not let go of his hand until the door, and when she did it was deliberate, a release that promised a return. The federal examiner's determination arrived by post on the 14th of November. Harmon had sent a copy to Nora directly, with a cover letter explaining what it meant, but Paul read the determination itself with her at the kitchen table and translated the legal language into plain terms as they went. The examiner had found the Wells claim to be validly filed and properly surveyed under the applicable standards. He had further found that the survey submitted by Davis Rourke used a methodology inconsistent with the updated Kansas standards, and that the discrepancy it purported to demonstrate was an artifact of the outdated baseline rather than a genuine irregularity in the original filing. The contest of adverse claim by Nora Wells was upheld. The county reassignment order was declared void as having been issued on the basis of a materially defective survey. The land was confirmed as belonging to Nora Wells in fee simple, as lawfully inherited from James Wells, deceased. Nora read it herself after Paul had explained each part slowly from the beginning, moving her finger along the lines. When she reached the end, she sat still for a moment with her finger on the last word of the determination, which was her name. Then she turned to look at Paul, and her eyes were bright with tears that she was not going to let fall because that was who she was, but they were there. "It's ours," she said, and then caught herself. "It's mine." Paul shook his head very slightly. "You said ours first," he said. "I like that better." She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed, and the laugh was the most open and unguarded thing he had ever heard from her, warm and real and a little surprised at itself, and he thought he would spend a very long time trying to earn more of that laugh. Harmon sent a further letter the following week indicating that the evidence gathered in the case, specifically the documentation of Rourke's fraudulent methodology, had been forwarded to the federal attorney's office in Topeka, which was considering an investigation into both Rourke and the circumstances surrounding the county judge's role in the reassignment. Carver was quietly replaced as Caldwell circuit judge by the following spring, and while the official reason given was a routine rotation, the people of Caldwell who paid attention knew what it meant. Rourke lost his surveyor's license the following year, after 2 other contested claims in different counties were examined in light of the Wells case, and Western Territorial Developments, whose principal investor was Harlan Briggs, dissolved quietly shortly after the federal investigation began. These were things that happened over months, and they were important, but they were not the center of what was happening at the Wells homestead, which was something more personal and more important, in the way that personal things are always more important to the people they are happening to. Paul had moved out of the barn by December, not into the cabin, because they were not the kind of people who would do it that way, but into a room he built himself in the lean-to on the east side of the barn, which he finished with a proper window and a small stove and a board floor, and which was considerably more habitable than the hay. He had not left. He had found the work there was to find at the property, and there was a great deal of it, fencing and water systems and the barn roof that needed attention, and the cabin itself that needed certain structural improvements that James Wells had been meaning to get to before his health prevented it. And Paul worked through those tasks with the steady focus of a man building something, not just maintaining it. Nora watched him build. She watched him the way she had watched him from the beginning, with that particular quality of attention that did not miss things, and she saw what it meant, the care that a man puts into a place that he thinks of as home, and what it told her about his intentions even before those intentions had been formally stated. The formal statement came on a Saturday evening in the first week of December, when the first real cold of winter had arrived, and the fire in the cabin stove was going strong, and they had eaten supper, and were sitting at the table with the lamp between them, talking about nothing in particular and everything in general, the easy, shapeless conversation of two people who have become genuinely comfortable with each other. Paul set down his coffee cup. He looked at her across the lamp. He said without preamble, because he was not a man who ornamented things that did not need ornamenting, "I'd like to ask if you'd want to marry me. Not right now if you're not ready, but eventually. If that's something you'd want." Nora was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was moving across the plains in the long, dark way of winter wind, and the fire ticked and settled. She was looking at him with those gray-green eyes, and in them he could see the careful person she was, the one who thought before she spoke, who did not give herself lightly, who had earned everything good in her life and had learned the cost of losing things. "You've been here for 2 months," she said. "I have," he said. "You don't have a piece of land, you don't have a cattle operation, you don't have anything fixed." "I know it," he said. "That's honest." "But," she said, and the word was slow and considered, "you have been here for 2 months every day in the cold and the work and the complications and the legal fights and the uncertainty, and you haven't once made me feel like a burden or a project or an object of charity. You've made me feel like a partner." "That's what you are," he said simply. She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said, "that's what I want. Yes." He reached across the table and took her hand, both hands, and held them. "Not right away," she said, quietly but clearly. "I want to know you longer." "As long as you like," he said. "Spring," she said, "if we still feel this way in spring." "We will," he said. She squeezed his hands. "I believe you," she said. They were still sitting like that when the fire burned lower and the lamp began to gutter, holding hands across the table as the winter wind worked at the edges of the cabin, neither of them needing to say anything more. December moved into January. The Kansas winter settled in properly, the kind of cold that does not negotiate, that simply arrives and states its terms and leaves you to manage accordingly. Paul added more insulation to his lean-to room, and kept the small stove fed and woke in the cold mornings, to help with the animals before the light was properly up. Nora made coffee strong enough to be taken seriously, and they stood at the window together while the dark field went slowly gray, and then pink, and then gold. And sometimes they did not speak for long stretches, and it was the best kind of not speaking, the kind that means two people are comfortable enough with each other, that silence is not something that needs to be filled. Miguel took note of the way things were going between them with the serene approval of an old man who has seen enough of life to recognize what is worthwhile. He did not say anything directly, but occasionally he made remarks in a quiet way about the property and its future, about the spring planting, about the east fence line that would need significant repair after the winter, remarks that were casually inclusive in their use of the word "we," and which Paul suspected were entirely deliberate. In January, a letter arrived from Harlan. He had received a communication from the federal attorney's office, confirming that a formal inquiry into Davis Rourke's survey practices had been opened, and that subpoenas had been issued. He also noted, with the dry precision of a man who deals in facts but is not unaware of the satisfaction they sometimes provide, that the inquiry had extended to include the awarding and compensation of the original survey contract, which would likely implicate whoever had commissioned and paid for it. Nora read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and said nothing for a moment, and Paul watched her, giving her the space the moment needed. Then she looked up. "My father would have liked you," she said. "I hope so," Paul said. "He would have liked you for knowing what was right and doing it. He didn't care much for men who knew what was right and looked the other way." She paused. "He also would have liked you for staying. He used to say that staying is the truest thing a man can do." Paul held her gaze. "Your father was a wise man," he said. She smiled, and it was the good smile, the full one, the one that reached the gray-green eyes and stayed there. February brought a cold snap that was unusual even by Kansas standards, the kind of cold that splits wood and freezes the water trough overnight and keeps the animals quiet and close. Paul spent 3 days repairing the water trough and reinforcing the barn door, and cutting the extra wood that the cold demanded. And Nora worked alongside him for most of it, because she was not the kind of woman who stayed inside while necessary work was being done outdoors. And after years of doing everything herself, she found it both useful and genuinely pleasurable to have someone working beside her who knew what he was doing. There was an afternoon during that cold snap when they were in the barn together, working on a split beam by lamplight, and the barn was warm from the horses and smelled of hay and cedar, and the comfortable animal smell of well-kept horses. And Nora was holding the beam while Paul fitted the splint piece. And at some point, they were working closely enough that their heads were nearly together over the joint, and he turned to say something about the angle and found her face very close. And she was already looking at him. He kissed her. He did it the way he did most things, without hesitation but without carelessness, with full attention to what he was doing. She kissed him back with the quality that characterized everything she did, completely and with all of herself present. When they stepped back from each other, she was looking at him with color in her face and a slightly altered expression, as if something that had been almost in focus had just become fully clear. "Spring is a long time away," she said. "It is," he agreed. "We could make it February," she said. He smiled. "We could make it February," he said. They were married in Caldwell on the 22nd of February, 1883, by the Reverend Thomas Hale at the small Presbyterian church on Market Street, with Miguel as the witness, and 3 of the neighboring farm families who had come to hear what happened at the Wells property, and had quietly made themselves allies of Nora's during the legal proceedings. The church was not large, but it was full enough, and it smelled of winter and candle wax and the particular stillness of a sacred place in the morning. Nora wore her mother's dress, which had been in a cedar chest since before she was born, and which fit her as if it had been made for this day. It was a cream-colored dress with small buttons up the front and lace at the collar, simple and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been kept with love. Her hair was down, which Paul had never seen before, and it was dark and thick and fell past her shoulders, and when she came down the aisle of that small church and found his eyes, she was smiling the full smile, the one that reached her eyes and stayed, and he thought with simple and total certainty that whatever the rest of his life held, this was the center of it. He said the vows clearly and meant every word of them. She said hers looking directly at him the whole time, not at the minister, and her voice was steady and certain. When Reverend Hale said he could kiss his bride, and Paul took her face in his rough hands and kissed her gently in front of that small congregation, Miguel made a sound of profound satisfaction from the front row, and one of the farming wives began to cry in the quiet, unstoppable way of women who have seen too much difficulty and find honest happiness almost unbearably moving. They rode home together in the bright February cold, side by side on the road back south, the same road they had ridden together on the first morning, and the cottonwoods along the creek were bare and gray and beautiful against the winter sky, and the property was there at the end of the road, exactly as it had always been, The cabin and the barn and the well and the 42 acres of good Kansas ground, and it was theirs. Spring came with the sudden extravagance that it always does on the Kansas plains, a burst of green that seems almost unreasonable after the long brown winter, and with it came the work that made the Wells property more and more what it was going to be. Paul used the last of his savings to buy 4 head of cattle in March, a modest beginning of the cattle operation he had been working toward for a decade, and the cattle grazed on the bottomland near the creek while he repaired the fencing along the southern boundary and extended the barn to accommodate them. The federal inquiry into Rourke and the fraudulent survey practices concluded in the spring of 1883 with a formal finding against Rourke, the revocation of his license, and a substantial fine. The accompanying investigation into the payments that had commissioned the fraudulent surveys pointed clearly toward Western territorial developments, and by extension to Harlan Briggs. And while Briggs managed to avoid criminal charges through the use of expensive attorneys and the argument that he had relied on professional advice in good faith, the scrutiny cost him his social standing in Caldwell and the political connections that had made Carver's cooperation possible. He sold his interests in the town within the year and moved to Wichita, where presumably he found new and different ways to conduct himself, though the Wells property was never troubled by him again. Thomas Harmon sent his final invoice in May, with a note that was brief and warm, congratulating them on the outcome and wishing them well. The note was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Paul Calloway, and Nora read it at the kitchen table and then propped it against the lamp where she could see it while she cooked, which Paul noticed and found deeply pleasing. Miguel came every morning still, and now he came to more than just a working arrangement. He was part of the family in the way of people who have earned their place through loyalty and years, and Nora treated him accordingly, and Paul followed her lead with genuine warmth, and the old man's eyes in the mornings had the look of a man who has found the place where he belongs and is grateful to know it. By summer, the property was expanding in small but real ways. Paul traded his labor for a second-hand plow and broke the east field for wheat, because diversifying made sense, and Nora had always meant to plant wheat and her father had intended it before he got sick. The wheat went in late summer with the focused optimism that planting always requires, the faith that what you put in the ground will come back up and be worth having. Nora found out in July that she was expecting their first child. She told Paul on the porch step in the morning, with her coffee in both hands. In the direct way she told him everything, looking at him steadily to see how he would take it. He took it by pulling her against him and holding on for a while, his face in her hair, and she laughed the warm, real laugh against his shoulder. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Yes," he said, very simply and very completely. "Good," she said. "So am I." The autumn of 1883 was the best autumn that either of them could remember, warm and gold and slow in the way of good seasons, with the wheat coming in better than expected, and the cattle putting on good weight and the evenings long and comfortable on the porch step, watching the big Kansas sky do what it does, which is be enormous and theatrical and indifferent, and somehow exactly what you need. Nora grew rounder and more beautiful, which Paul told her with the regularity of someone who means it, and she received the information with a look that was partly pleased and partly skeptical and entirely characteristic. She kept working through the autumn, not foolishly but sensibly, doing what her body allowed and resting when it required rest and refusing to be treated as fragile, which he did not try to do, because he understood who she was. Miguel delivered the news to the neighboring farms that a child was coming to the Calloway place, and the community of people who had quietly supported Nora through the legal fight expressed their happiness in the practical way of rural communities, with jars of preserved food and offers of assistance, and the general warmth of people who have decided that a family deserves well. The baby came on a Thursday morning in March of 1884, after a long labor that Paul spent entirely in the cabin, because he refused to be sent outside, holding Nora's hand and being as useful as a man can be in a situation where the most useful thing is simply to be there. And the midwife, Mrs. Graves, who had been delivering babies in the Caldwell Valley for 20 years, worked with calm competence and eventually placed in Nora's arms a small, red-faced, loudly opinionated boy. "A son," Nora said, looking at Paul with an expression that had no precedent, that was new and entire and large enough to fill the room. Paul looked at his son, who was approximately 10 minutes old and already clearly had opinions about the world, and felt something that reorganized his interior landscape permanently. They named him James, after her father, which was what they had agreed before he was born, and James Wells Calloway came into the world in the same cabin where Nora had been born, on the same land that had been nearly taken from her, and it seemed to both of them to be right in a way that had something to do with justice and continuity and the stubbornness of good things to survive. Miguel held the baby that afternoon with the practiced ease of a grandfather, which was what he was in all the ways that mattered, and James tolerated this with the imperious calm of a person who has not yet decided whether the world deserves his approval. The spring planting that year was done with a baby sleeping in the shade and waking to object loudly at regular intervals, and Nora and Paul worked the fields together with Miguel, moving back and forth between the planting and the baby with the cheerful and slightly chaotic rhythm of a new family. The wheat came up well. The cattle herd grew to 12 head by the following autumn. Paul added a second room to the cabin when James began to be mobile and require more space for his activities, which were mostly locomotion and investigation, and the systematic destruction of anything within reach. Nora found this hilarious and also exhausting, and Paul found it both of those things and also the most purely joyful thing he had ever been part of. James Calloway was a child of the land in the way of children who are born into it, who learn to walk on the same ground they will one day work, who grow up knowing the names of everything that grows and flies and lives on the property. He was curious and energetic and loud in the way of healthy children, and by the time he was 2, he was following Paul around the property with the focused devotion of a person who has chosen his mentor and intends to make the most of the relationship. In the autumn of 1885, Nora told Paul that a second child was coming. This time she told him over supper, setting the words down like cards on the table, watching his face. He smiled slowly. "Are you well?" He asked first because she was what mattered most. "Very well," she said. "Good," he said, and reached across and covered her hand with his. The second child arrived in June of 1886, a daughter, and they named her Clara after a grandmother Paul had never met, but had heard enough about to know that her name deserved continuation. Clara Calloway came into the world with a composure that her brother had entirely lacked, looking at everything with large gray-green eyes that were her mother's entirely, and Paul held her in the first minutes and thought, with the clarity that is available only in moments of pure presence, that everything he had done in his life, the wandering and the working and the losses and the failures and the choosing to ride toward a gate rather than past it, had led him directly and precisely here. The farm grew. The community grew around it. Caldwell itself grew, in the way of Kansas towns in the 1880s, adding a proper school building the year Clara was born, and a second church, and a physician who set up a permanent practice rather than making occasional visits, and a dry goods store that stocked things beyond the bare necessities. Nora became, over those years, a person of standing in the community in the natural way, not because she sought it, but because she had earned it through the public record of what she had done, and what had been done to her, and how she had handled all of it. Women came to her when they had difficulties with land matters, which was not uncommon in those years, and she helped them understand their rights with a directness and a competence that was rooted in very personal experience. Paul became known as a man to come to for fair dealing in cattle, and for the kind of practical wisdom about property and land law that was unusual in a man without formal training. And in 1887, he was asked to serve on the County Land Board, which was a body that reviewed disputed claims, and which under its previous composition had been rather too comfortable with certain kinds of irregularity. He accepted, and he served for 4 years, and the board's findings during those years were consistent and fair and based on evidence, which was not as universal a standard in such bodies as it should have been. The Wells property, which the community had long since come to call the Calloway place without Nora minding, because she was a Calloway now, and the Wells name lived in her heart and in her son's middle name, and in the deed that was recorded in both her father's name and her own, became in those years a proper and prosperous small ranch. Not grand by Eastern standards, not the kind of operation that got written about in newspapers, but real and solid and self-sustaining, with 42 acres of good ground and a herd of cattle that numbered 30 by 1888, and a wheat field that produced consistently, and a kitchen garden that Nora tended with the same methodical care she brought to everything. Thomas Harmon came to visit in the summer of 1887, passing through Caldwell on his way to a case in Dodge City, and Nora fed him a supper that silenced him with appreciation for several minutes, and Paul brought out a bottle of whiskey that was for occasions, and they sat on the porch in the long summer evening and talked about the case and what it had led to and where things stood now, and Harmon looked at the property and the children. James running in the field with the dog they had acquired the previous winter, and Clara sitting in Nora's lap with her steady gray-green eyes observing everything, and the old attorney said, with the mild satisfaction of a man who is seldom sentimental but makes an exception for what deserves it, "This is the right ending to that business." "It is," Nora said, looking at Paul. Paul looked back at her across the porch in the summer light and thought the same thing, without reservation or qualification. James grew up fast the way children do when they are fed well and loved well and have space to run. By the time he was 6, he had learned to saddle and ride, under Paul's patient instruction, and by 7 he was helping with the easier cattle work with a seriousness that made Miguel smile his slow, approving smile. He had Paul's steadiness and Nora's directness and his grandfather's name, and he was a child who seemed to know, in the instinctive way of certain people, exactly where he belonged. Clara was quieter and more observant than her brother, and she had an affinity for the garden, and for books that Nora recognized as her own qualities returned to her in a new form. She would sit for long stretches in the kitchen while Nora cooked, asking questions about the plants and what they were for, and why things grew the way they did, with the patient curiosity of someone building a real understanding of the world rather than collecting facts. In 1889, when James was 5 and Clara was 3, Nora discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Paul in the early morning before the children were up in the bedroom of the expanded cabin that had become their real and settled home, and he was quiet for a moment in the way of a man checking himself, taking inventory of things, and then he said, "Are you glad?" "I'm glad," she said firmly. "Then so am I," he said. The third child arrived in November of 1889, another boy, strong and loud and immediately opinionated, who they named Robert after Paul's father, because it was time to bring his family's name forward too, and Robert James Wells Calloway made it very clear from his first hours in the world that he intended to be noticed, which was a quality they found both exhausting and delightful. The cabin was full, and the farm was working, and the land, her father's land, the land that had been nearly taken from her on a Wednesday morning in September of 1882, was as healthy and as much itself as it had ever been. There were evenings, even then, when Nora would walk to the cottonwoods by the creek after supper, when the children were settled, and Miguel had gone home and Paul knew where she was, and let her have the quiet, and she would stand at her father's grave for a few minutes and talk to him in the way that people talk to the dead, not because they think they are heard, but because some things need saying regardless. She told him about the children and the farm and about Paul, especially about Paul, about what he had done and who he was, and how she had come to know that there were men who stayed and who meant it, and that she had found one. Paul sometimes came to find her there, not intruding but arriving, and stood beside her at the grave, and she would lean against his shoulder without speaking, and they would stand together in the last of the evening light under the cottonwoods, and there was nothing in it that needed words. The summer of 1890, James Calloway was 6 years old and had been asking for 2 years to learn to rope, a request Paul had been managing with a combination of patience and the age restriction of "when you're big enough," which James had been testing empirically every few months by standing very straight next to the rope hanging in the barn and comparing heights. On a Saturday morning in July, Paul took the rope down from the barn and took James out to the corral and taught him the fundamentals with the same patient precision he brought to everything he taught, and James was a fast and focused learner, and by noon he had gotten the hang of the basic overhead loop. Nora watched from the fence with Clara beside her and Robert on her hip, and the look on her face watching the two of them in the dust of the corral, Paul patient and deliberate and James fierce with concentration, was the look of a woman who knows, bone deep, that she is exactly where she belongs, with exactly the people she loves, doing exactly the life she was meant for. And when James finally got the loop over the fence post and looked up with a triumphant expression that was so entirely his father's expression that Nora laughed out loud, Paul looked over at her from across the corral with that quiet, steady attention of his, and she shook her head at him fondly, and he smiled back, and Clara tugged on her skirt and asked what was funny, and Robert objected to something with the comprehensive loudness he applied to all of his objections. And the horse shuffled its feet in the dust, and the Kansas afternoon opened above them in its enormous, indifferent, beautiful way. Thomas Harmon retired from his law practice in 1891 and wrote Paul a letter to that effect, recommending a younger colleague for any future needs and including a line at the end that said, "The Wells case remains, in 30 years of practice, among the work I am most satisfied to have done, not for the legal reasoning, though that was sound, but for what it protected." Paul read that line to Nora in the evening. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Write him back and tell him thank you. Tell him we still have the receipt he gave us." They did still have it. It was in the tin box under the kitchen floor, beside James Wells's original deed and the county surveyor's credentials and the federal determination and the final order confirming Nora's title, all of it kept together, all of it real and documented and irrefutable. The tin box that her father had kept for exactly this reason, because he had known that someday someone would try to take what was his, and the papers were all that would stop them. He had been right. And the papers and the man who had known how to use them had been enough. The Calloway Ranch existed for many decades after that September morning in 1882, when a man on a gray horse heard two strangers talking outside a feed store and made a decision that changed the rest of his life. The land stayed in the family. The deed was renewed and recorded and renewed again, and the coordinates were exactly those that George Ellsworth had surveyed in 1879 using the correct standard, unchanged, unchallenged, entirely true. And when James Calloway was grown and working the land himself, and his children played in the same bottomland by the creek where he had played, the tin box was still there under the kitchen floor, because some things you keep not because you think you'll need them again, but because they tell you who you are and where you come from and what you were worth fighting for. Nora Wells Calloway lived to see her grandchildren on that land, which her father had broken his back for, which a powerful man had tried to take from her with a forged survey and a corrupt court, which a stranger on a gray horse had ridden to defend before he even knew her name. She lived to see the cottonwoods by the creek grow broader and taller over her father's grave and the graves of others she loved, because that is how life goes, It takes and gives and takes and gives. And what you can do is hold on to what is real and be honest about what matters and choose, when you are lucky enough to have the choice, the people who stay. Paul Calloway lived beside her through all of it, every season of it, the hard winters and the good harvests and the children's growing and the neighbors' difficulties, and the small and large dramas of a life built on a piece of Kansas ground. He was not a famous man. He never became an attorney. He never ran a large cattle operation. He built one good life on one good piece of land with one remarkable woman, and he stayed, the way he had promised on a November evening with the fire going low and the winter wind at the walls. And he meant it the same way at the end of those years that he had meant it at the beginning, which is the truest thing a person can say about a life they have chosen. On a warm evening in August, when the children were grown and the grandchildren were sleeping inside, and the two of them were sitting on the porch step the way they had sat on countless porch steps over the years, Nora leaned against his shoulder and looked out at the land in the late light, the cottonwoods casting their long shadows toward the cabin, the cattle visible as dark shapes along the creek, the sky doing its enormous theatrical thing above it all, and she said, quietly, what she had said so many years ago at the beginning of it, when the crisis was past and the papers were filed and things had become, by some grace of the right person hearing the right conversation and doing the right thing, survivable. It's ours, she said. And Paul, who had come from Missouri with nothing fixed and no particular destination, who had stopped at a water trough and heard two strangers talking and made a single clear decision that turned out to be the best decision of his life, looked at the land and then at the woman beside him and said, "It has been for a long time." The stars came out over the Kansas plains, the same stars that had wheeled overhead on all the September and November and February evenings since the beginning, indifferent and permanent and beautiful in their reliability. And the cottonwoods moved in the warm night wind, and the land was quiet and full and entirely itself, and it was theirs.